They didn't come from five-star chefs, they came from Grandma's worn-out recipe box. These ground beef recipes weren't flashy, but they fed families through tough times with love and flavor. Until now. Once you taste them, you'll wonder why no one told you sooner. Rag Mop Casserole was not just a recipe. It was a reflection of how weirdly wonderful American kitchens could be in the 1950s. Inspired by the popular novelty song of the same name, this dish felt like someone took everything comforting about a weeknight dinner and tossed it in a baking dish on a dare. It all started with ground beef, browned and seasoned in a skillet, then layered with canned spaghetti. You know, the kind drowning in that slightly sweet tomato sauce, and finished off with a cheesy breadcrumb topping that always ended up extra crispy. You could tell this came from a time when convenience and flavor had to shake hands in a hurry. Moms loved it because it used shelf-stable pantry staples. And in a lot of kitchens across small-town America, it was. But if you think that was comfort food turned up to 11, just wait until you hear about the next one, a dish that was practically designed to stretch $1 and fill a table. Shipwreck casserole had a name that made you curious and a flavor that made you stay. No one really knows where the name came from. Some say it is because it used whatever ingredients survived in the pantry. Others say it is just what happened to your kitchen when you made it. But if you were growing up in the 1960s or 1970s, you probably saw this show up on your plate more than once. Ground beef was the anchor, and from there, things got creative. Potatoes, sliced thin or cubed chunky, laid the foundation. Rice, usually the minute kind, came in next. Then canned tomatoes, the workhorse of every budget-friendly meal, tied it all together in a bubbling, slightly tangy mix that somehow always hit the spot. And if you think that is resourceful, wait until you see what happened when people tried to make steak rolls without the steak. Beef birds, sometimes called mock steak rolls, were the kind of food that made you feel like you were having a fancy dinner, even if the meat came from the budget bin. The idea was simple but genius. Take seasoned ground beef, flatten it out like you are making an edible canvas, roll it up with stuffing or sometimes chopped onions inside, then tie or skewer it like it is some French roast on Sunday dinner. These little bundles were browned in a pan and sometimes finished in gravy, soaking up every bit of flavor like they had been waiting all day for it. The texture was soft, the taste was rich, and the presentation, well, that part made you feel like you were dining at a place that had real cloth napkins. They were a perfect disguise for humble ingredients. And just when you think the American kitchen could not get more inventive, along came a dish that turned ground beef into a noodle-topped flavor bomb with a crunchy surprise. Chow mein hot dish was a Midwestern potluck legend. It walked into the room carrying the scent of soy sauce and sizzling beef and left behind nothing but an empty casserole dish and a few requests for the recipe. Born sometime between post-war optimism and the suburban casserole boom, this dish took inspiration from Chinese-American takeout and made it its own. Ground beef was browned with chopped onions and celery, then mixed with a savory sauce, usually soy sauce and a can of cream of mushroom soup. That combination might sound odd, but it made everything come together with a velvety, umami-heavy punch. But the real fun started when you dumped a whole can of crunchy chow mein noodles right on top before baking. But if that flavor combination sounds bold, buckle up, because the next dish on this forgotten road trip adds soda to the skillet and somehow makes it work. Sloppy Joe pie was what happened when someone decided that sloppy joes deserved a throne. You started with the classic filling, ground beef, tomato sauce or ketchup, a hint of mustard or Worcestershire if you were feeling adventurous, all simmered until it thickened into that perfect sweet, savory sloppy joe consistency. But instead of sandwiching it in a soft bun, you would pour it into a casserole dish and crown it with a golden biscuit crust. Sometimes it was homemade dough, sometimes it was straight from a can, but it always rose into a fluffy, buttery topping that made the whole dish feel complete. Some versions used cornbread instead, which gave it a southern twist with just the right amount of sweetness. And even though it was born in a time when ground beef ruled the dinner table, Sloppy Joe pie had enough personality to still turn heads today. But if you thought ground beef had done it all, just wait until you meet the recipe that turned soda pop into secret sauce. CocaCola beef skillet might sound like something dreamed up at a county fair food stand, but back in the 1960s, it was a weeknight marvel. You took a skillet, browned up a pound of ground beef with onions, added a healthy squeeze of ketchup, and then, here's the twist, poured in a splash of Coca-Cola. That was the secret sauce. The soda added a surprising depth, a sticky sweetness that balanced the tang of the ketchup and rounded out the beefy base. It cooked down into something thick and glossy, like a glaze that made every bite feel more indulgent than it had any right to be. Kids went wild for it, and parents loved that it took maybe 15 minutes to get on the table. Coca-Cola beef skillet was the edible proof that the best meals often come from a bit of whimsy and whatever is sitting in the fridge door. And if pasta was your pantry fallback, then the next recipe might just be your new meatloaf obsession. Beef macaroni loaf was what happened when mid-century homemakers got bored of plain old meatloaf and decided to shake things up, just a little. At first glance, it looked like the usual mix of ground beef, breadcrumbs, and seasoning. But inside, hiding like a delicious surprise, was elbow macaroni, cooked just shy of tender and folded right into the mix. Some versions even swapped out breadcrumbs entirely and used the pasta as the binder. Then came the tomato soup, poured in for moisture, color, and that unmistakable tangy sweet kick that Campbell's fans know all too well. The result was dense, hearty, and oddly elegant, like meatloaf had finally grown up and gotten a little flair. And because macaroni stretched the meat further, it was perfect for feeding bigger families on a budget. But for folks who wanted a more southern touch, the next dish took cornbread to places it had never gone before. Hamburger Spoonbread Casserole was as southern as sitting on a porch swing with a glass of sweet tea, and it brought all the heartwarming charm you would expect from something served at a 1940s church supper. Spoonbread, for the uninitiated, is not exactly bread and not quite pudding. It is somewhere in between. It is soft, warm, and creamy, like cornbread that has decided to ditch its edges and just melt in your mouth. Now imagine that heavenly texture layered over seasoned ground beef. The beef underneath was usually cooked with onions, garlic, and a dash of pepper or hot sauce. This dish was a hug in a casserole dish, soft, savory, and so filling you might not need anything else on the plate. It was also one of those recipes that always tasted better the next day if there were leftovers at all. But if this feels too soft and cozy for your taste, let us head into something born straight from scarcity and grit. Wartime ration hash was not glamorous. It did not pretend to be. But in homes across America during the 1940s, it was dinner, and often a lifesaver. This dish was the ultimate answer to food rationing and meat shortages. You would take whatever you had, maybe a handful of ground beef, a bruised potato, a few limp carrots, and you made it work. Breadcrumbs or oats were added to stretch the beef as far as it could possibly go. Sometimes there were bits of canned green beans or peas tossed in, and if you were lucky, an egg to bind it all together. Everything went into a pan and got crisped until the edges browned and the bottom stuck just a bit to the skillet. Flavor gold, right there. It taught families how to use every last crumb, and it gave a warm, filling meal when the world felt cold and uncertain. But when times got a little better, and people had a bit more to spend, things got saucier, cheesier, and a whole lot more comforting. Old-school goulash, or as some knew it, American chop suey, was the dish that proved ground beef and elbow macaroni were soulmates. This one-pot wonder became a fixture on stovetops from Maine to Missouri. It started with browned beef, onions, and garlic, all bubbling away in a pot. Then came the crushed tomatoes or tomato sauce, which turned the mix into a deep red stew. Toss in a few handfuls of cooked macaroni, and suddenly you had dinner for 6, and maybe lunch tomorrow. What made goulash so special was not just the taste, though that was plenty satisfying. It was the simplicity. It was comfort food with no rules, and that made it a favorite in kitchens where imagination mattered more than a well-stocked pantry. Goulash was the dish that filled plates and hearts at the same time. But if you think that was creative, wait until you see what happened when someone took a bag of corn chips and turned it into dinner. Corn chip beef bake was born from the kind of pantry raid that happened in kitchens all across America in the 1970s. Imagine this. You have a pound of ground beef, a half bag of corn chips, a can of tomatoes, and that lonely packet of taco seasoning tucked away in the cupboard. What do? You make dinner magic. This casserole was unapologetically crunchy, cheesy, and bold. You browned the beef with onions and taco seasoning, then layered it with crushed Fritos, cheese, and tomatoes. Some folks threw in a can of kidney beans, others swore by adding sour cream on top right before serving. No matter how you spun it, this dish was like a Tex-Mex lasagna dreamed up during a grocery store strike. It baked into a bubbling golden masterpiece that was equal parts nacho, taco, and weeknight savior. Parents swore by it for potlucks, and just like that, a new casserole classic was born. But if you think that is inventive, wait until you see how cabbage and beef teamed up to stretch every dollar without missing a beat. Beef and cabbage skillet was not flashy, but it was reliable, and back in the post-war days, that counted for a lot. This dish came from the same logic that made Victory Gardens bloom and ration stamps necessary. Make the most of what you have. Cabbage was cheap, hearty, and available year-round. Ground beef, when you could get it, was used sparingly. So together, they made a meal that could stretch across a week if needed. The process was simple. Brown the beef, toss in shredded or chopped cabbage, season with whatever you had, salt, pepper, vinegar, maybe a splash of soy sauce or tomato paste if you were lucky. The cabbage softened into ribbons, soaking up every bit of beefy flavor while adding its own earthy goodness. You ate it straight from the skillet, hot and steaming, with maybe a hunk of bread on the side. It was survival food that did not taste like sacrifice. And if that sounds hearty enough, just wait until we take this same idea to the great outdoors with foil, fire, and a little campfire nostalgia. Campfire foil packets were one part meal and one part memory. If you ever went to a summer scout camp or had a backyard cookout in the 1960s or 1970s, chances are you have made one of these. It started with a square of foil and a sense of adventure. You piled on raw ground beef, thin sliced potatoes, carrot coins, and slivers of onion. A little salt, a little pepper, maybe some garlic powder or ketchup if you were living fancy. Then you folded it all up, sealed it tight, and tossed it into the coals, or the oven if you were indoors. What came out 20 or 30 minutes later was something far greater than the sum of its parts. Some families added Worcestershire sauce or a pat of butter before sealing it. Others just kept it simple. But either way, it was delicious. It was also fun. There was something magical about unwrapping your own little packet and digging in with a fork. But if you wanted your beef with a bit more spice and southern flair, the next dish brought jambalaya right into casserole territory. Beef Jambalaya Bake took everything you loved about Louisiana comfort food and gave it a weeknight twist. Traditional jambalaya was made with shrimp or sausage, but when ground beef was what you had, you did not complain, you improvised. This casserole was warm, spicy, and overflowing with flavor. You would start by browning the beef in a skillet with onions, bell peppers, and celery, the Cajun holy trinity. Toss in some garlic, tomato paste, and a good shake of paprika or cayenne pepper, and suddenly, the whole house smelled like dinner was about to get exciting. Then came the rice, which cooked in the pan with beef broth or tomato juice until everything swelled and soaked up the seasoning. Some families added beans or corn. Others threw cheese on top and baked it for an extra kick. It was the kind of dish that got passed around the table fast and left nothing behind but crumbs. And if you think baking jambalaya was clever, just wait until you see what happens when you stuff a hamburger inside an onion. No bun required. Bunless stuffed onion burgers were like something straight out of a low-carb fever dream, but in the 1970s they were downright trendy. Back then, people were starting to think more about their diets, less bread, more vegetables, that sort of thing, but they were not about to give up ground beef. So, someone had the brilliant idea to turn onions into edible burger buns. Here is how it went. You hollowed out a whole onion, filled the center with seasoned ground beef, sometimes mixed with breadcrumbs, cheese, or egg, then sealed it up and baked it in the oven until the onion softened and the beef cooked through. The outside got golden and sweet, the inside juicy and rich. Sometimes a little tomato sauce or barbecue glaze was poured over the top, making it look fancy enough for company, but still easy enough to make on a Wednesday night. It was strange, it was bold, and it worked. These burgers were filling, full of flavor, and just different enough to be exciting. And if you thought stuffed onions were the height of beefy comfort, wait until you see what happened when mashed potatoes got paired with gravy thick enough to stand a spoon in. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes was the kind of meal that made you feel like you were sitting in a booth at a roadside diner, even if you were just in your pajamas at the kitchen table. This was pure 1950s and 1960s comfort food, humble, hearty, and wonderfully filling. You started by browning ground beef with onions until it was sizzling and fragrant, then stirred in flour and beef broth to create a thick, savory gravy that clung to every bite. Some folks added a splash of milk or a pat of butter for extra richness. Either way, it worked. This dish was cheap, easy, and practically guaranteed to silence a hungry family. It was also endlessly adaptable. Peas, corn, even a fried egg on top if you were feeling bold. This was a meal that made leftovers feel like a blessing. And just when you think ground beef could not get more cozy, the next recipe brings in a ring of flaky biscuits and a dose of party time charm straight from your grandmother's cookbook shelf. Beef and biscuit ring was the edible version of a kitchen handshake. Simple ingredients coming together in a way that felt a little bit fancy. This one was big in the 1950s and 1960s, the kind of dish you made when company was coming over and you wanted something pretty on the table. You would brown up a skillet of ground beef with onions, season it well, and stir in tomato sauce or Worcestershire for a saucy bite. Then came the biscuits, either homemade or straight from a can, no judgment here. You arranged them in a circle on a baking sheet or dish, spooned the beef mixture into the center, and baked until the biscuits puffed up golden and the beef was bubbling away like it had somewhere to be. It was a hit at parties and potlucks alike, and if there was cheese melted on top, forget about it. Plates were wiped clean. But if you really wanted to feel like you were dining at a steakhouse on a hamburger budget, the next dish took things up a notch. Mock prime rib patties were what you made when you had champagne taste and a ground beef budget. These clever creations came about during a time when steaks were for special occasions, if at all, and home cooks needed to serve something that looked the part without draining the wallet. The trick was in the seasoning. You would take ground beef and mix it with salt, pepper, onion powder, and sometimes a hint of garlic or a dash of soy sauce. Then you shaped the mixture into thick, steak-like ovals and seared them on both sides until a crispy crust formed. The key was finishing them in the oven or in a skillet with a splash of beef broth or homemade au jus to keep them juicy and give them that steakhouse sizzle. Served with mashed potatoes or buttered peas, they looked and smelled like the real deal, enough that you might fool your taste buds for a few bites. It was a dish built on imagination and a real craving for luxury. But if savory was not enough and you liked your beef with a little sweetness, just wait until pineapple crashes this party. Pineapple beef bake was a casserole that felt like a luau in your oven. It came straight out of the 1960s, when tiki culture had Americans decking out their living rooms with bamboo furniture and sipping drinks with paper umbrellas. In that same spirit, someone decided to toss ground beef into the mix, and the result was surprisingly delicious. You would brown the beef, stir in soy sauce, onions, and bell peppers, then layer it into a casserole dish with pineapple chunks, usually canned, syrup, and all. The pineapple gave it a tropical tang that cut through the richness of the beef, while the soy sauce and aromatics grounded it in something warm and familiar. It was quirky, no doubt, but it had personality. It stood out on a table full of casseroles, and for a while, it was the kind of dish that brought smiles, and maybe a hula dance or two. But if you think pineapple was a bold move, wait until ground beef went from casserole filler to party centerpiece. Ground beef fondue balls were the kind of appetizer that made cocktail parties in the 1950s and 1960s feel just a little more exciting. Long before charcuterie boards and sliders took over the scene, These little beef bites ruled the hors d'oeuvre table. The base was simple: seasoned ground beef mixed with cooked rice or shredded cheese, rolled into balls, and sometimes even wrapped around a cube of cheddar. Then came the fun part. You either baked them until crispy or fried them golden brown and served them with a side of bubbling fondue. Cheese, tomato, or mustard-based dips were all fair game. They were easy to make ahead, easy to freeze, and easy to eat, which made them perfect for house parties, church socials, and anything that required a plate of finger food with a little flair. They may have started as a budget-friendly snack, but they were anything but boring. And if your idea of fun is a skillet full of beef, rice, and Tex-Mex spices, then the next recipe is a spicy slice of vintage perfection. Texas hash was not born in a diner or dreamed up by a chef. It came from necessity, flavor, and the magic of one-pan cooking. This dish was a lifesaver in kitchens during the 1960s and 1970s, especially when money was tight but taste still mattered. It started in a skillet, like most good things do. Ground beef hit the pan, followed by chopped onions and bell peppers. As everything sizzled and softened, in went the tomatoes, sometimes fresh, sometimes canned, and a scoop of cooked rice. Chili powder or a few dashes of hot sauce gave it a warm Tex-Mex flair without pushing into full-on heat. It was hearty, filling, and endlessly flexible. Some families added corn or black beans. No wonder it stayed in rotation for decades. But if Texas hash was the rebellious teen of ground beef meals, the next dish was pure whimsy, because what could possibly go wrong with meat and mashed potatoes shaped like a bird's nest? Potato nest casserole was one of those meals that made dinner feel fun, even when it was just a regular Tuesday. Moms across America loved this dish in the 1950s and 1960s because it combined two unbeatable dinner champions, potatoes and ground beef, into something playful, presentable, and most importantly, practical. You started by shredding potatoes, usually by hand, and seasoning them with salt, pepper, and maybe a little egg to help them hold together. Then you packed those shredded spuds into muffin tins or small ramekins, pressing the centers down to form little nests. After a quick bake, those nests crisped up around the edges and stayed soft inside. That was when the real fun began. Into each one went a scoop of ground beef, browned with onions, and seasoned to your liking. Some added peas or corn to the meat mixture, while others spooned in tomato sauce or gravy. Back into the oven they went until everything was hot and bubbling. The result was a golden brown, savory, bite-sized dinner that looked as good as it tasted. But if presentation was not your thing, and all you wanted was pure, unfiltered comfort food, the next dish takes you straight back to the heart of the American living room. TV dinner. Salisbury steak was more than just a frozen tray. It was a weeknight ritual, a microwave miracle, and a classic in its own right. But long before it became a staple of the television tray lifestyle, there was the homemade version, and let us just say, it was something special. This dish was a blend of ground beef, breadcrumbs, egg, and onion, all shaped into thick oval patties that mimicked the feel of a fancy steak. Then came the gravy, rich, dark, and loaded with caramelized onions. Some families added mushrooms, others swore by a spoonful of ketchup or Worcestershire to deepen the flavor. The patties simmered in that sauce until they were melt-in-your-mouth tender. Served alongside buttery mashed potatoes and canned peas, it was the kind of meal that made you want to pull up a seat in front of the old tube set and settle in for the evening. Even when frozen dinners became the norm, there was something about homemade Salisbury steak that just hit differently. But if you wanted something with a southwestern soul and a little cornbread crunch, the next recipe is a true casserole classic that still holds its ground. Beef and cornbread. Tamale pie was a hug from the Southwest, baked golden brown in a casserole dish. This one dated all the way back to the 1940s, when resourcefulness met regional flavor. Ground beef was the heart of it, cooked down with onions, garlic, and sometimes diced green chilies or sweet corn. Tomato paste or enchilada sauce brought the whole mixture together into something tangy, rich, and unmistakably bold. But the real showstopper was the topping, a thick layer of cornbread batter poured over the beef and baked until it puffed up like a golden crown. It was budget-friendly, filling, and packed enough punch to wake up even the sleepiest of taste buds. Families across the American Southwest and far beyond served it up with a dollop of sour cream and maybe a little salsa on the side. But if you are someone who loves the flavor of stuffed peppers but hates all the prep, the next dish was a skillet solution that changed the game. Stuffed green pepper skillet was the answer to every busy home cook's prayers. Sure, stuffed peppers looked nice on the plate, but hollowing them out, blanching them, and carefully baking each one? That took time and energy many folks just did not have. This recipe solved the problem by tossing everything into one skillet. You started by browning ground beef with onions and garlic, then added chopped green peppers. Not hollowed, not roasted, just chopped and ready to go. Then came the rice, tomato sauce, and seasoning. Some folks spiced it up with paprika or Italian herbs. Others added a splash of beef broth to help everything simmer together. As it cooked, the peppers softened and the rice soaked up all the juices, turning it into a one-pan meal that was rich, hearty, and every bit as flavorful as the classic version. It was the kind of dish that never let a busy night win. But if you liked your skillet meals even saucier and a little more old school, the next dish was like a warm handshake from your grandmother's recipe box. Mock Swiss steak was a stovetop classic that delivered comfort without complication. Now, it had nothing to do with Switzerland, and it was not really steak either, but none of that mattered once the fork hit the plate. This dish was pure 1950s ingenuity, turning ground beef into a dinner that felt fancier than it had any right to be. The beef was shaped into thick oval patties, then dredged lightly in flour and browned until the edges crisped. But the real magic happened when the tomato and onion gravy hit the pan. Sweet, savory, and slow-simmered, that sauce softened the patties until they practically melted. Some folks added a bit of garlic, a pinch of oregano, or even a splash of vinegar to give it extra depth. Served over mashed potatoes or wide egg noodles, it was the kind of meal that made you sigh after the first bite. And just when you thought ground beef had done everything it could for dinner, it decided to show up at the breakfast table and brought the eggs and cheese along for the ride. Egg and beef bake, also known by some as breakfast surprise, was the kind of dish that turned a simple Sunday morning into something worth writing home about. Popular at church brunches and potluck tables throughout the 1960s and 1970s, this casserole was a hidden gem in the world of ground beef cooking. It started with scrambled eggs, sometimes real, sometimes powdered, depending on the budget, mixed with seasoned ground beef, sautéed onions, and a generous helping of cheese. Some versions included potatoes, others stirred in day-old bread cubes to stretch the meal and soak up all the flavor. It was perfect for early risers, late sleepers, or anyone who believed breakfast should be more than just toast and coffee. And if that sounds like a surprising way to wake up, just wait until you see what happened when health food met comfort food in the 1970s garden patch. Beef-stuffed zucchini boats were one of the more wholesome trends to come out of the 1970s health food movement, and they still hold up today. This dish was all about balance: protein-packed ground beef, fresh veggies, and just enough cheese to keep things interesting. You started with zucchinis, halved lengthwise, scooped out just enough to make room for the filling, and lightly salted to soften. The filling was where the flavor lived: ground beef browned with garlic, onions, sometimes a touch of tomato or breadcrumbs, and herbs like oregano or parsley. Once that savory mixture was ready, you packed it tightly into the zucchini boats, topped everything with shredded cheese, cheddar or mozzarella usually, and baked until bubbly and golden. And nutritionists gave it a standing ovation. But if you are craving something more indulgent and flakier, then the next dish will take you straight to the savory, golden heart of the American Midwest. Midwest meat. Pie was not a shepherd's pie. It was not a pot pie either. This dish stood proudly on its own, wrapped in flaky pastry and packed with flavor that hit like a warm embrace. Ground beef was the star, sautéed with onions, garlic, and sometimes carrots or peas, then thickened with beef broth or gravy until it reached that perfect spoon-coating consistency. All of that got tucked into a homemade, or store-bought, we won't tell, pie crust and sealed shut like a delicious little secret. Once baked, The crust turned golden and buttery, and the filling stayed rich, savory, and steaming hot. It was a meal that stuck with you, perfect for cold nights, family gatherings, or just when you wanted to feel like you were eating something special. But for a truly nostalgic flavor bomb that needed only a skillet and a squirt bottle, the next recipe made weeknights a lot more exciting and a little sweeter too. Ketchup glazed meat patties were weekday magic. No frills, no fuss, just ground beef, shaped into thick little patties, pan-fried to a crusty edge, and glazed with that one bottle every American kitchen had on standby. The glaze was simple: ketchup, maybe a little brown sugar or mustard if you were feeling creative, sometimes even a splash of vinegar or soy sauce for balance. Once the patties were nearly cooked through, that sticky sauce went right on top and bubbled into a sweet, savory layer that made each bite sing. Served with buttered noodles, canned corn, or instant mashed potatoes, this was the kind of dinner that came together fast and satisfied everyone at the table. And just when you think ketchup had claimed the crown for best beef topping, the next dish comes sizzling into view with a spoonful of gravy and a name borrowed from something a lot fancier than it turned out to be. Meat potato candy is a very strange dish. It's incredibly practical, it's very economical, and it comes out of a time where those two things were all that people wanted in their food. It's something we can thank the Depression and wartime periods for. It was back then that families were stretching things and making nutrient-dense treats out of literally whatever they could find, barter or grow. The dish was something that took some American classics and put them together very nicely. You had mashed potatoes, ground beef, which was usually pork or beef, but even Bolognia would do, and then you had sugar. Sometimes people would spare a bit of flour so that this could be binded properly. Now most people would also prefer their candy to be like a typical toffee, but times were tough. The idea behind the candy was more practical than it was fun anyway. This time people thought that they would make a calorically dense dish that would be easy to carry around in their pockets and bags instead of needing separate storage. It would also be high in energy, so it would be like an instant pick-me-up. In that regard, I think they did pretty great. Would you use it the same way at work? I know some of you aren't fond of soupy dishes, but please hear me out. Beef paprikash. It sounds complicated to make, but I know your grandma, just like mine, made it without batting an eye. Imagine tender beef simmered in a rich paprika-infused sauce, bursting with smoky and spicy flavors. This dish is like goulash's cousin, wouldn't you say? Beef paprikash is a traditional Hungarian dish where it was a hit in kitchens where spices were basically like family heirlooms. But, contrary to popular beliefs here in the United States, paprikash is traditionally made without beef or macaroni noodles. Shocking, right? Its origins date back to the 9th century Magyar shepherds as a simple meat and onion stew prepared in heavy iron kettles known as bograks. In the 15th century, invading Ottoman Turks introduced a new spice to Hungary, paprika. While the rest of Europe remained lukewarm towards this red chili pepper from the New World, Hungary embraced it, and paprika has since become a defining element of Hungarian cuisine. Paprikash is kind of in between a soup and a stew. Unlike some stews, paprikash is not overly packed full of beef and vegetables. It is a little more brothy. But through the cooking process, the broth becomes a little thicker and very rich in flavor. And here's another fun fact for you. Paprika is actually made from dried bell peppers and has been around since the 16th century. And if you thought paprika was just for sprinkling on deviled eggs, think again. So, people used to think the best way to enjoy supper was to get some hash browns from a local diner. But if your grandpa made the right choices in life and as a result you now sip on caviar for fun, you would be more interested in something like terrine de foie gras. This was something that was a big part of gourmand culture all throughout the early 20th century. And it was something that saw a spike in popularity after the war had ended. French haute cuisine was the apex predator in the fine dining restaurant scene, especially in big boy cities like New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. The dish itself was definitely one of the hallmark recipes of its time, being nothing less than absolute extravagance. It was something you'd associate with high society, with people who had big gates and the latest Porsche or something. Even food connoisseurs were amazed at how well the dish had fit into the American palate, despite how it was not something that you would typically see in an American menu at all, but that just goes to show how much times changed right after the wars had ended. Squirrel stew might sound unusual today, but it was a popular dish in rural areas. Yep, our bushy-tailed friends were once a common ingredient in many kitchens. Also known as Brunswick Stew, it was a tomato-based stew generally involving local beans, vegetables, and originally small game meat such as squirrel. However, many variations from around the world used rabbit meat too. The origin of this meaty stew is controversial at best, as the states of Virginia and Georgia both claim its birth, with Brunswick County in Virginia and the city of Brunswick in Georgia claiming it was developed there. To keep things peaceful, let's just say Virginia and Georgia both played a role in creating this delicious stew. Squirrel meat was easily hunted and provided a necessary source of protein. With the rise of chicken, squirrel stew has fallen out of flavor. But hey, this one is pretty easy to whip up and will satisfy your Thursday night meat cravings like no other. Hamburger upside-down pie is really one that's for people who like to experiment with their food. It has a lot of practical thought put into it, but somebody clearly had a lot of fun making this. You take ground beef, and then you take the concept of a baked pie, and what do you get when you mix those two together? A layer of seasoned ground beef packed beautifully at the bottom of a baking dish, laden with onions, tomato sauce, biscuit crumbs, and a cornbread topping. This pie would be baked and then flipped upside down so the bottom layer of beef was the first thing you had, and it was filling enough to feed your entire family and then some. This dish was a part of resourceful home cooking, and it makes me agree with something I saw earlier. It said that being bored is actually good for you because it brings out your creativity. I think that people had so little to work with in these times that they were for once thinking genuinely outside of the box, and sometimes that led to some actual eureka moments, and other times it was fun, little interactive dishes like this. While it wasn't remembered much, it was still a pretty convenient meal that you could even freeze for later if you weren't feeling like eating it all in one go. Understandably, because this is a behemoth to take down on your own. If you're a fan of retro cooking, though, this is a good place to start. Those interesting casseroles don't just end with peanut. Bologna burger bakes were actually a part of mid-century home economics creativity. It was thanks to the advent of processed food becoming such a widespread thing. Bologna, Spam, and hot dogs were all incorporated into everyday meals in many different kinds of ways. This dish was something that involved thick rounds of bologna, and it was mixed with all sorts of different kinds of seasonings. People particularly loved what paprika and bay leaves could do for the dish. They thought it added a spicy kick to the first few bites that dissolved very nicely. Once the dish had established itself as a powerhouse of the 1950s, it was slowly starting to become something you would see in dorms, in homes, parties, and just something your teenagers would be messing around with. It helped that it was such a nice and affordable source of protein, and that Bo Logan was already becoming perceived as a burger substitute. Ground beef was still expensive thanks to all the rationing, and home cooks thought that if they couldn't get that regularly, they may as well get to repurposing. No worries. Don't confuse regular old boring meatloaf with this special Dutch oven meatloaf with crackers. No, don't get your wires crossed, it's definitely different. Back in the day, Grandma really knew how to jazz things up and make this classic into something unexpected, just by adding some crackers. When crackers are added to the mix, they become like little sponges full of flavor, absorbing juices and adding to the texture of the dish. But this still doesn't really make it that different from the regular meatloaf. So where does the difference lie? Well, it lies in the Dutch oven baking. This oven, or pot as some might say, locks in flavor and moisture like nothing you've ever seen before. The result? A tender, savory meatloaf with a perfectly crisp outer layer. And Grandma knew how to serve it right, with a thick layer of ketchup glaze on top. Because sometimes, more is more. Plus, when you add a side of mashed potatoes, it'll be like you're biting into nostalgia. Back in the Great Depression, meatloaf was a go-to because it stretched a small amount of beef into a meal for the whole family. And crackers were cheaper than breadcrumbs, and we all know Grandma knows how to save some bucks. Now, the French weren't fans of the rabbit pie, so they decided to whip up a pigeon pie instead. This delicacy dates all the way back to the 17th century when James Hart, a Scottish physician, wrote in 1633 that pigeon pies were usually served with far too much pepper. It became an instant hit after Hart's paper, and people started cutting down on the pepper a bit. This crispy dish was a savory game pie made of pigeon meat and various other ingredients traditional to French cuisine. The buttery crust made it a luxurious treat which was common on banquet tables. It was a tradition for wives to make pigeon pie after their husbands spent long days hunting for the delicious bird. But hey, tastes change, and so do our feathered friends. If you ever wanted to try some saddle of venison, then you could go to any number of steakhouses and fine dining continental restaurants in many states. Some of these, like Le Pavillon and Maison Robert, made a name for themselves as being one of the best places to go to if you wanted French food done right. Others, like La Caravelle and the 21 Club, were easily some of the best places to go for if what you were looking for was a very well-made steak. Either way, it was something you would find only where the cats with the biggest piles of gold would come to play. You know, at Maison Robert, it wasn't just damn good venison they were selling. You even got wild boar there. Basically, this dish was meant for all things special and memorable, and if you really wanted to go all out either for yourself or someone else, then you could definitely just do this because it was probably the safest choice amongst all of them. The venison saddle was really something that elevated venison and what it could do for you, as well as opening people's minds to more venison-based dishes. Butter. Next on our list, we're going to be dealing with beef and grape casserole, which is an example of mid-century American cooking really leaving no stone unturned. It was a combination of flavors that was pretty unexpected. Most people think that this dish came out around the 1940s to the 1960s, and that makes sense. Fruit-based experimentation with your typical average Sunday meals was a lot more common. What was interesting was the influences for this dish. Swedish meatballs with lingonberries was another thing that was growing really popular as a recipe for home cooks, and a lot of Americans tried to come up with their own spin-offs of recipes like this. Typically, it had ground or cubed beef, and this was browned with onions. Then, it would be combined with grape jelly or entire grapes, and a sauce would be made for the broth. Tomato paste or Worcestershire sauce would also go in this broth, and some versions also used canned mushroom soup and sour cream to help create a more velvety texture. While the dish was definitely really ambitious and set out to accomplish a lot of bold, difficult-to-work-with flavors, it ended up not really lasting past the 60s. It seems like that one decade was an isolated incident as far as casseroles were considered. Still, is this something you would like to try? Or do you like your grapes on a separate plate from your meat? Fruit and meat casseroles have actually existed for the better part of a few centuries. They've blended sweet, savory flavors in a lot of different ways, and they were even considered luxurious at one point. In medieval Europe, you would often find people pairing fruit with meat. In Native American culture, you can find dishes like pemmican, which are incredible superfoods. In the 19th and 20th century, you can find all sorts of references to fruit and meat-based combinations in Southern and Midwestern American cooking. Pork and apples, ham and pineapple pizza, the list goes on and on. This dish was a casserole that a lot of people were divided about, though. The thing with these savory fruit and meat dishes is that how well they work changes depending on what the format is. The decline of fruit and meat casseroles in the 70s and after that was influenced by how people were shifting their tastes away from casseroles in general, especially out-of-the-box combinations like this. These were also seen as overly sweet over time, and they didn't manage to keep up with the trend of wanting lighter, softer, and easier food. The 1970s saw the rise and dominance of the timeless Lobster Thermodor, a dish that still has all the best restaurants in the world using it to prove they're worth every little best of your money. It has a long history of being a status symbol, one that represents all kinds of indulgence and wealth, from fancy night outs that you saved up for to the finest meals on cruise liners. You might not know, though, that Lobster Thermodor actually has a lot of French history to it. The dish used to be a luxury dining item since well before it ever made a name for itself in America. After the 50s, people had begun to explore continental dining experiences more, and this was particularly common amongst the upper middle class. They loved themselves a good Thermidor, if nothing else. Now, I know you all think lobsters can be a bit of a chore to eat sometimes, but they're 10 times more of a headache to make too, and even more expensive to get. You had to employ some real skilled chefs to make something out of a good Maine lobster, so only the rich could afford the outrageous prices some menus would charge. In the 70s, Lobster Thermidor was something you would see in gourmet prix-fixe menus, which would often cost more than $80 per couple. Stuffed prune meatballs are a really good example of sweet-savory cooking. This was something you would see commonly throughout both Europe and America, and that was doubly true if we're talking about the 19th and 20th centuries. This was a dish that was a mix of prunes with one of 3 different kinds of meats. People would either use beef, pork, or veal. And after the meat had been softened to the point it could be shaped and pressed into a meatball, prunes would be stuffed inside them. Some people were a bit freakier than others and would shove an entire prune up there, but some would chop it first. While this might seem like an innovative idea, it's actually not all that new. Dried fruit and meat combinations, especially sweet and savory ones, are really old ideas. They go back all the way to several different cultures present in Europe. You'll find them in Scandinavian, British, Jewish, and German cultures, and if you go on over to Asia, you will still find many sweet and savory combinations. This was a dish that did really well in the 20th century, especially whenever there were Jewish holidays, but over time, the American palate started to settle down with what was familiar instead of stuff like this. It couldn't really last and compete with regular meatballs. Spam. Beef hash is a budget-friendly dish that came out during the times where people had literally nothing to work with. The name of the game was stretching whatever bits and pieces of meat you had for as long as you possibly could. This happened to just be the best tool available for doing that, and man, it was seriously efficient. Hash itself was just a chopped and fried mixture of different kinds of meat scraps, potatoes, and onions. It actually goes back several centuries, and the addition of Spam and beef together was something that was a World War II innovation. Spam was something that became a household staple mostly due to the shelf life it had and the incredible amount of affordability. It was something you could also mix in with other kinds of meats to make these hybrid dishes. I'm not talking about meat bits, but actual cuts of meat. Most Spam beef hash recipes had very staple ingredients that everyone was used to, but it was the convenience of having everything packed like that in such a neat little format. Nowadays, Spam's actually making a return thanks to how expensive food in general has become. Today, it's almost entirely forgotten as chicken has taken over the dinner table. Jellied eels were a staple on the dinner table back in the 1900s. This dish was whipped up in London in the 18th century, when a bored chef decided to mix things up a bit. Here's the thing. Eels were dirt cheap back in the day, so they were everyone's favorite source of meat. The dish consisted of chopped eels boiled in a spiced stock and allowed to cool and set, forming a jelly. It was usually served cold and made a good substitute for dessert. Since it was light on the pockets, the English loved to serve it at dinner parties and festivals. It also made its way out to other parts of Europe such as Denmark and Sweden, which came up with their own versions of the jelly. You won't find a lot of people talking about jellied eels now, because it has largely disappeared from the British menus. By the 70s, Tornados Rosini had made its own name in steakhouse culture, and it was one that no one would be forgetting anytime soon. All kinds of decadent steak dishes went and came throughout the history of America's culinary phases, but this one was something that was always popular among old money. It wasn't exactly something that I would say was as popular as Chateaubriand, but it was definitely something that was a really well-regarded meal among people who were fine dining professionals. It was something that was basically known for being benign as over the top. It was something that had grand as its middle name, and it was even named after a famous Italian composer from the 19th century, Gioacchino Rossini. It was something that screamed, "I'm rich," to everyone that eyed your waiter as they came to serve you. It combined all kinds of rare ingredients too. You had filet mignon, foie gras, Madeira, and wine, which were all really luxury imports. French cuisine was something that was considered the absolute peak of culinary sophistication, and Tornados Rosino was one of the most over-the-top things you could get for yourself. As far as pricing went, each cruise ship and luxury hotel had their own price ranges, but you could expect to pay anywhere between $60 to $100 back then for an entire course, which is definitely a lot. Moving on to something that is American-made, Salisbury Steak, seasoned ground beef patties, pan-seared to perfection, and then smothered in a rich onion-loaded gravy. What's not to like? I bet most of you haven't heard the backstory of Salisbury Steak, so let me educate you. It is best known as a staple of TV dinners and bargain buffets. The Salisbury Steak actually has its beginnings as a proposed cure for digestive illness during the Civil War. If you didn't know, digestive illnesses killed more soldiers during the Civil War than combat did, and a diet rich in beefsteak and coffee was one suggested cure. The inventor of the Salisbury Steak, Dr. James Henry Salisbury, was an early pioneer of germ theory and of diet being a factor in health. While some of his ideas may be outdated today, his affection for beefsteak and his promotion of its positive effect on health have persisted. While patties of ground beef are common fare, the Salisbury steak was cemented in the American lexicon during World War I. In many English-speaking countries, there was a movement to limit the use of German-sounding words, so the army served Salisbury steak rather than Hamburg steak and Liberty sandwiches instead of hamburgers. Sure, it may not be the health trend it once was, but let's be honest, it's a comfort food icon for a reason. A savory ice cream with ground beef is probably the best way to end this list. The entire time, we've had unconventional, imaginative dishes that really break the definition of what should count as a savory dish. I mean, you grow up thinking all ground beef belongs in a casserole or a taco, and then you find out people used to be eating ice cream with it, hell, even making it with the stuff. The idea of ground beef ice cream is, historically speaking, definitely one of the more extreme culinary experiments. It became a really popular thing during times where people were experimenting with cooking, and while it might be really strange to us today, it actually checks out historically. For the longest time, dairy and protein have always gone together, and custards, liver pâtés, and even early versions of mincemeat pies were things that were always considered sweet and savory. The most common version of a ground beef ice cream was something that involved ground or pureed beef, and that would be blended into a cream or milk-based mixture right before it would be churned. Recipes also relied on beef broth or consomme, while others used aspic or honey and caramelized onions. It was a lot like modern-day bacon ice creams if you think about it. Home cooks also experimented with all sorts of unusual ingredients, and while ground beef was always considered a niche, underground experiment, it did do fairly well for how out-of-the-box it is. The classic beef and potato casserole. Reminds me of a time when 40-step recipes from Instagram didn't exist, and it was all about simplicity and comfort. The layers of browned ground beef, golden potatoes, and a creamy sauce could warm even the coldest hearts. Topped with a generous amount of cheese, of course, because when you're at grandma's, more cheese equals more love. Why was this dish suddenly forgotten? Maybe it's because all of the new recipes call for superfoods and gluten-free alternatives, which this casserole is definitely not. It's a classic, old-school ground beef dish. The magic of beef and potato casserole lies in its simplicity. It's basically just a few staple ingredients thrown together and baked until bubbly. No fuss. It's hearty and delicious. Plus, who doesn't love a meal where everything is combined into one pan? Less cleanup means more time in front of the TV watching your favorite 80s sitcom. Seconds are almost always guaranteed, so you could also say that this dish is perfect for meal stretches and it's budget-friendly. Pressed duck, a French-inspired masterpiece, is just as complex as it sounds. The dish involves cooking a duck and then using a special press to extract the blood and juices, which are then used to create a rich, flavorful sauce. You heard that right? A sauce made out of blood and bone marrow. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, this dish was a showstopper at French restaurants back in the day, and its unique taste spoke for itself. The complex dish was a specialty of Rouen, and its creation was attributed to an innkeeper from the city of Duclair. It's also known as canard à la presse, and is a specialty of the Tour d'Argent restaurant in Paris. Cooking pressed duck isn't a job for the weak and requires special time and effort, which is exactly why it has become a rare dinner time on our tables now. And then, of course, not everyone has a knack for eating a sauce made out of bone marrow. To start off, the classic roast beaver tail. Now, I know this one sounds a tad bit unusual right off the bat, but this meaty meal was once a cornerstone of survival for Native Americans and early settlers. Imagine this, trading a juicy steak for a flat, scaly beaver tail. But hey, survival is survival. They said it tasted like pork rinds, so maybe it wasn't as bad as it sounds. Beaver tails were roasted over an open flame until the skin was crisp and the fat underneath rendered down. Beavers were a crucial resource for Native American tribes, and they didn't let any part of the rodent go to waste, not even the tails. Roast beaver tail wasn't just sustenance. It was a delicacy among American Indians and trappers. The best part? It wasn't just finger-licking delicious, but also provided a high-energy meal for those braving the frontier. Mock turtle soup is something that I'm dead sure you would not have seen coming. See, it's something that came out of 18th century England as a substitute for real turtle soup, which, by the way, was insanely popular in these times. People used to actually consider it something of a delicacy. During the Georgian and Victorian eras, green turtle soup would have sea turtles in it, and it was an incredibly prized dish popular among the local aristocracy. Before you crack a nice little cutting-edge joke about how British cuisine is the strangest thing on the planet, this was also popular in American high society, and it's something that got us through the Depression. That's right, mock turtle soup was something that people would make as much as they could when real turtles weren't around or were too expensive. Now, real turtle meat is known for having an incredibly rich and gelatinous broth. The key to mock turtle soup was just to start with the head of a calf or an oxtail, boil it down with a blend of vegetables like carrots, celery, and onions, and a spice rub, and slow cooking it. Next, once all the natural collagen was extracted, people would usually add in wine or sherry or Madeira, and this was really common in traditional turtle soup. It replicates the texture of the actual turtle meat, and cooks would try very hard to get that down right. It's one of the most interesting pieces of mock food culture we have, and it shows how good people got at imitating different kinds of foods without the core ingredients. Now, another dish that originated from Europe, stuffed kohlrabi. This traditional Hungarian dish features bulbs of kohlrabi stuffed with a flavorful pork and rice filling and served alongside a kohlrabi soup made with leftover scraps and greens. I know it doesn't sound very appealing, but if you're adventurous, it's worth a shot. But what is kohlrabi? Popular in Northern and Eastern Europe, kohlrabi is sometimes called a German turnip. Kohlrabi may look like an alien creature, but if you've never tried it, you're in for a treat. It has a texture similar to broccoli, but it's sweeter and not quite as smelly. Stuffed kohlrabi is a very traditional Hungarian dish, but there's no one single way to make it. Much like Italians and their marinara, every family will have their own different version of it, with different meats. Some feature beef instead of pork, or a mix of the two, as well as many different stuffings and seasonings. But this one is particularly unique in that it uses all vegetables, including greens. It makes its own side dish by pureeing the greens and leftover pulp from the hollowed-out bulbs into a gorgeously green, flavorful soup. Brilliant, right? Imagine a cake recipe that makes its own frosting or something. That would be sick, am I right? Or am I right? Kohlrabi has a mild, slightly sweet flavor, kind of like a cross between a cabbage and a turnip. Once stuffed, these little guys were baked until tender, with the beefy filling bubbling away inside. If your grandma was making kohlrabi, just know that she was way ahead of her time, since it can perfectly fit into today's low-carb keto lifestyle. If you think about it, pickled beef balls were really just as old-fashioned. They were born out of a preservation technique that basically combined chopped beef with vinegar, salt, and some spices that were then cured in a briny liquid. This was done so that the meat would last a lot longer than it usually could, and it was likely something that came out of pickled meat traditions stemming from Europe. German Sauerfleisch and the Jewish dish pickled tongue have some pretty strong resemblance to this dish. The acidity of the vinegar would do more than just preserve the meat. It would also be wonderful at tenderizing the meat so that you could actually use cheaper cuts of meat. Most rural families could not afford premium cuts because of how expensive they were, but nobody really liked eating chewy, tough, rubber-like meat. These pickled beef balls were an easy solution, and one that you could make in a batch for a rainy day. Ground beef and oat fudge is something that's literally blasphemy if you treat it by today's standards, but it's something that really fits within what you would call Depression-era food. It was a creative way to use meat, especially as far as sweet dishes were considered, and the idea of making beef together with oats and chocolate might have come out of dishes like suet puddings, where the meat was used for texture more than it was used for flavor. Still, those are different dishes. Most versions of ground beef and oat fudge were pretty controversial. They were made by finely grounding the beef or boiling it and then mixing it with cocoa powder, sugar, oats, and butter, and sometimes with sweetened and condensed milk or eggs. Some recipes even went as far as including vanilla in it or cinnamon so that the lingering flavor of meat could be masked and it would not be overly gamey. The fudge was also pressed into a pan and chilled and sliced, but the dish was not something most people ate out of preference. It was just really efficient at filling you up and giving you a decent amount of protein. If one of these sparked a memory or made your stomach growl, tell us which one you would bring back in a heartbeat. And do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this with someone who still calls it Hamburger Night.